Behind the Headlines on WLIW. This is our weekly opportunity to sit down with the award-winning journalists who cover the news on the east end of Long Island and do a bit of a deeper dive into the week's headlines. I'm Joe Shaw. I'm the executive editor of the Express News Group. We publish the Southampton Press, the East Hampton Press, the Sag Harbor Express, the website 27east.com, and Express Magazine. My co-host is Bill Sutton. He's the managing editor of the Express News Group. Good morning, Bill.
Hi, Joe. Hi, everybody.
Good to see you. We have this week Denise Civiletti, who's the editor of Riverhead Local. Hey, Denise.
How you doing?
Beth Young, who is the editor of the East End Beacon. Hey, Beth. And we have a special guest. We have Carlos Sandoval, who is a columnist for the Express News Group. Hey, Carlos, how you doing?
I'm doing fine, thank you.
So let me explain to folks, Carlos, this is sort of your farewell appearance on the show. You are going to be leaving us as a columnist this month. You are going to be leaving the area after the death of your husband in June, Michael Hampton. You have our deepest sympathies from all of us on the panel. It's a big life-changing moment, I know, for you, and it's sort of going to be the end of your time on the East End. And we thought that it was a good opportunity to talk with you a little bit about your time on the East End, and you can bring us some real insights, I think, from the Latino perspective and the Latino community on the East End. And we're going to miss that, frankly, as a columnist. I think you really brought that for our newspapers, and it's something that's been very valuable during your time here. When you've been out here, how long on the East End?
I've been out here since 1991, actually.
So it's been I was thinking about the fact that you've seen a real evolution on the East End of the Latino community and its role out here. Can you talk about that a little bit? If we go all the way back to 1991, how are things different back then?
I'm gonna reverse that for a second, because I just had an experience that, for me, spoke to how different things are from what they were then. Mm-hmm. I was at the bank today, and I overheard two of the bank officials talking, and the conversation started in Spanish. Then it started switching into English, and it was complete Spanglish. Now, I'm accustomed to hearing that in Miami, where I've lived at times. I grew up with it in Southern California, but the fluidity and the ease within which this was happening from two professionals at the bank was absolutely extraordinary to me. And for me, it showed the integration of the community and the level at which it's arrived now after since I guess 3 decades since the early 90s. I did come out here in the early 90s, and at that time the number of Latinos were sort of few and far between. We weren't exactly we were kind of invisible to the general population. There were numbers, but it was workers who were adopting people who were living out in Montauk at what are now little resort hotels that were then housing 12 people in a room at a time, 3 families. And I've spoken to those families; they're friends. I was sort of surprised, my own limitation, to see at that point the beginnings of a Latino community out here, and I began to get somewhat intrigued by. I became intrigued by it.
Where were the Latino community at that time? Where were they coming from?
Where were they coming from?
Yeah.
There were Colombians, all over. Colombians, Ecuadorians, not that many Mexicans out here. There's a legacy of that. If you go to some of the little bodegas along either on 27 or else, and I'm thinking East Hampton, on North Main Street, most of the produce or products there tend to be South American, not Mexican. You do get those, but you'll see like little frozen guinea pigs in the frozen food department, which is a Peruvian thing. So it's yes, and so it was from a variety of places, and at that point people were moving. Like the launch off point tended to kind of be Montauk, and then eventually out here on the South Fork.
Why do you think it was Montauk?
Housing, I think, primarily. That was a place where there were these motels And so people could go. It was a chain migration thing. Someone would go up because a cousin or a brother-in-law had said, "Come on up. There are opportunities here." They would come up from Colombia, for example, and stay on, and they'd bring up their families. As I said, one of my columns was a two-parter about this family that we got to meet. He became the head carpenter when we were redoing this house, and his wife was our house cleaner for a long time. And they had two daughters, one of whom was born in Colombia, the one who was born here. And when they arrived, the husband came out, he was just told, "Here's a train, go to the end of the line, and someone will be there to meet you."
Wow.
And he ended up in Montauk.
Wow.
And he ended up in as I mentioned before, one room, it's not even a studio. I guess maybe there was a studio. There'd been a kitchenette in there. And there were 12 people. And they tell the story of how they would come in, they would sleep on the floor, roaches crawling over them. And he came out first, and his wife came out. And their daughter at that point was 4 years old. And they were all living in there. Eventually, some people moved out. They kind of took over that spot. But my friend, who was a housekeeper, got her first job at one of the motels along Old Montauk Highway, and it was about a 5 mile distance. She would walk there with her then 5-year-old daughter, and in the cold and snow and the like. And the daughter would sit there and stand there and either help or just stay outside the rooms. That daughter is now a media mogul. She works for a distribution company, and she attends Cannes to pick up product. And the other daughter is, she's doing quite well. She graduated with the University of California system. Extraordinary stories. My friend now has his own business, a small scale contractor, and his wife has developed a huge enterprise of cleaning homes. And so, she doesn't necessarily have to go and clean. I shouldn't say huge, but, it's a nice, she has several crews working for her. And they own a house out in Springs. So, that is a trajectory of those who have been lucky. I'm going to be jumping around in time now. I had to have some work done on the deck, and the fellow that my friend assigned to it was working very hard. It was one of our heat waves this summer, and we have a southern exposure, no shade there, hot, sweltering day, and he was out there sanding with a hand sander because they didn't want to. The wood was kind of warped. They didn't want to ruin the deck through the sanding, and he was on his hands and knees sanding in that sun. I took one of the umbrellas, rolled it over to him, said, "Please, roll this out. Here's some water. If you need anything, just let me know." I had similar jobs when I was in high school, and I couldn't withstand them for more than a day or two. And this guy, enterprising, well spoken. I'm not sure what his level of education was, but if I had to guess, I would say it was certainly beyond high school, which is an accomplishment. Possibly would have been a professional, I don't know. And I was then told that he was going to be returning to his home country because his lawyers had advised him that things were getting too hot up here, just too tight under ice, and so he decided to self-deport. So for me, that is an example of what we're losing in terms of enterprising, dedicated people who.
I'm
Yeah,
sorry. Did he self-deport with the idea that he'll try to come back
that
legally
we.
at some point, or
I don't know. I don't know if that's going to be an option for him or
I just
not.
don't know if people
Yeah.
are buying that. You hear the administration say that self-deport now, and we'll get you back in legally, and I don't know that anybody's really buying that. But
I don't think he bought into that. I think he
yeah,
just didn't. He has a son, and he didn't. I'm not sure the age of the son. He didn't want that stress and tension for the family, and he just felt it was, after the and he, I guess, flew into Mexico and crossed the border. Didn't make it a couple of times, but it was an arduous crossing of the desert. But after all that, and then had worked for 2 or 3 years, considered himself lucky to have had a job. But just I don't his experience ended up being a very negative one. He was reluctant to leave after all that, from my sense, he was reluctant to leave after all that he went through to get here and what he was hoping to provide for his family. But he saw no options. And his lawyer told him, look, you're better off going home now than going into an ICE detention center.
Sure.
So
That's got to be a scary
that's yeah.
prospect from what you see of those detention centers.
I'm sorry. Oh yeah.
That's got to be a very scary prospect.
Oh,
that you're gonna end up being stuck in
yeah.
one of those.
I when filming one of my films, was able to get into an ICE detention center in Arizona, and it was a spa compared to what I think people are going through these days, and I considered it hideous and horrible then. You couldn't bear the cold. It was freezing all the time, bright lights. It was a prison that had been converted into a detention center. So people who had committed no crimes were being held in prison.
Well,
And
I'm thinking of the ones outside the country too that right now
yeah,
that are just
yeah, hideous conditions. Just heard reports today of leaky roofs that never stop, sweltering conditions, everyone overcrowded, no food or bad food, no communication. They're gulags, internal gulags right now for people who are not the criminals, who are simply here looking for opportunity, as did so many people's ancestors, and yet here we are, treating them like prisoners.
Carlos, I want to talk about perception, because I think it's really interesting that on the East End, I think we have a different perception of the Latino community because we see so many Latino men and women working various kinds of jobs and in different levels of the economy. And we have school districts where more than 50% of the kids are Latino now. They are part of our community. I think we see Latino people a little differently. And I mean, clearly that's not true for everybody. But is there a difference between the way, like, the perception of the Latino community here? I feel like there is so much less hostility. And this was true even back, you did the movie, the documentary about Farmingville, about all of the stress between the communities then. And that was, when was that? That was the early...
that came out in 2004.
Early 2000s, I was going to say. Even then, I was struck, and I arrived on the East End in about 1998, and I was struck by the fact that that seems so foreign to me, that it was happening just, a few dozen miles away, but it was a perception that I was not seeing around me on the East End. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's a fair statement now, but at that time it wasn't entirely the case. I actually remember taking a trip out to California and being lucky enough to hang out in Santa Barbara for a couple of days, and came back and wrote a piece, an essay that actually was at that point used in appeared in Guest Words at the Star, and in it I reflected on how the experience I felt here was one that was going to be more inclusive. That it would be quite different from what I'd experienced in Southern California, where there was, schools had been segregated just before I started attending them. Graveyards segregated in various parts of the country. All deep Jim Crow stuff, and the ensuing hate. Being called Beaner, which I was. So this was what I perceived at that point was a different model. And then I remember you mentioned my film Farmingville, which I started in the year 2000, and I was beginning to sense a sense of change out here, that I was beginning to experience microaggressions, not so much towards me, but if I was standing in line with some workers, I would see them mistreated and kind of not being able to claim their spot. And my antenna was up. I remember my husband saying, "You're just being hypersensitive," and I said, "No, I'm not." But I was trying to grapple with that issue of how can I express this without seeming hypersensitive? How can I express this in a way that will be real for other people? And I had a friend who was actually a Pulitzer Prize winning writer who was in Chicago, and he sent me this news item that was about the hate-based attempted murder of two Mexican day laborers in this town of Farmingville. And then I thought, this is the hook. This is where I am. This is clear proof and evidence. And so that was going on out here, not as extensive, but I don't know how many of you remember the famous volleyball wars that were going on back in the early 90s, where in the Springs, pardon?
Talk about
Yeah,
that. I'm not sure everybody's going to know what you mean.
yeah. To the extent that I can fill in the blank here. Others jump in if they would, but there were workers, families that were settling into the Springs. And as people are wont to do on a Sunday, they would blow off some steam by playing volleyball in backyards. And these games became larger and larger, more and more competitive, and there was people were gathering around, picnicking, and it was the neighbors were understandably upset because this was a lot of activity going on in these quiet residential neighborhoods. So that became a flashpoint of tension for a while, and I've forgotten the exact resolution for it. I think there were some ordinances that were adopted, but that was the tip of the iceberg, was a legitimate complaint about noise. That really there was a lot else going on underneath it, and it was that where you draw that line between those two things that prompted me to want to do Farmingville, because there's such a thing as legitimate concerns. I mean, dozens and dozens of people men crowding around a street corner in the small town of Farmingville, vying for jobs, and overcrowded housing there. That was a legitimate concern to me. The response was not. And the response ultimately manifested itself in this hate-based attempted murder and subsequently the firebombing of a house in Selden, the adjoining community. But
Something too, if I can jump in, Carlos,
yeah,
something that really struck me about that whole scene in Farmingdale was that a lot of the folks who were most angry about the Latino people in their midst came from immigrant families themselves.
yeah, no, absolutely true. Um, Center Island is filled with a second or third generation immigrants from Italy, Poland. There were some names I couldn't really pronounce because they were Westnesiac. But there were that was primarily who it was, and that already struck me then too.
Why do you think that happens? Why do we have a tendency to continue that kind of fear, even when you've lived it yourself, or you've been through it generations before your family's come through that kind of experience?
Oh boy, you've just hit a minefield there. And I think that the times we are living in, um, where many people responded to Trump, taps into the same vein, and that is one of identity and, to a degree, privilege, and seeing those things threatened. So I think that it's the last one into the boat gets to draw up the plank. It's providing yourself with a little bit of status because there's someone else that it's a Southern strategy that took place, and it's what happened in the South after the Civil War. White people wanted to maintain some means of status, and they did so. Therefore, they wanted to maintain black people on a lower rung, even though slavery was no longer in effect. So there's that sort of thing that goes on there. But there's also, I think, and this we can all relate to, which is the sense in which your community is being assaulted. You move to the suburbs, you or your parents move to the suburbs in order to have a quiet, leafy existence, and suddenly there's all this stuff going on in your backyard, and that's not what you bought in for. That's not what you bought into. While making the documentary about Arizona, I had a chance to interview then Arizona Legislature Representative Kirsten Sinema before she became a state senator, before she became a U.S. senator, and she had seen Farmingville, which tries to take a more objective view of things, and that's why she agreed to the interview. But she said something that I thought was quite interesting. She said that people who travel up here from other countries have had a chance to make that emotional adjustment. They have affirmatively decided to leave home and enter a new life. People who are the receiving communities are sitting at home. They didn't make that decision, and suddenly they find everything around them changing. That's going to trigger fear and concern. And that to me is legitimate. I mean, these things are all very, very difficult to unwind. Um, but it's those are big, complex thoughts and distinctions that people don't have the time to make necessary every day. And so then you get, people feeling overwhelmed, and you get by people crossing the border. Um, and you also have the media that's willing to fuel that fire. And you get media silos. And, that combustible situation leads to where we are now, with people having supported mass deportation in the abstract and confronting it in reality now and saying, no, no, I want to control at the border. I don't want families separated again, or people dragged off and abused, and people being snatched off the street by masked men. That's not what we want. That's not what we want. That's not what they bought
Other
into.
side of the spectrum, though, and Joe talked about, on the East End, people maybe, traditionally the last couple of decades being a little more accepting of the Latino community. But I think I wonder whether in the last few years that's kind of turned on its head a little bit, because
Yeah.
I think people are a little more emboldened, and a little more people who may have quietly held on to um, you know, feelings of disrespect, hate, even that unacceptance of the other, that they may have quietly held on to that because it was not socially acceptable in the community per se. That now it's a little more acceptable, and I wonder if those people are being a little more vocal about it.
Yeah. Beth, I'm sorry, you had a question as well, or
I think maybe
okay,
you could continue this.
okay. Um, yeah, going back to the 90s, actually in this year, at this point, it was early 2000s. And I also had this perception that we out here in the East End were sort of immune to the kind of reaction and vitriol that was taking place in Farmingville. But I remember attending a town meeting where I'd forgotten what the specific issue was, but the anger and the rhetoric from some people who attended was as bad, if not worse, than what I confronted in Farmingville. Um, it was like a precursor to MAGA talk, and that surprised me. And but it also made me realize there is something more going on here than I thought at first. So I think it's always been there, and kind of hidden under the surface.
Kind of runs
I,
deep.
yeah, but I would say that I don't know that, because I'm not out in the community enough to be able, particularly in the past several months, to get a feel for what's going on among the people that have been here 20, 30 years or more. Um, I would say that everyone is feeling alarmed and attuned, but let's not forget that the number of Latinos that voted for Trump. So, there's that factor in there as well. Um, what I will say is that going back to two things. One is going back to that column that I wrote about, the model possibly here in the East End being a welcoming one, and then turning out quite not to be because of Farmingville. I've felt that this community has done a lot to try to draw people in, to try to integrate people in a positive, affirmative, and an affirming way. And I think we see that in the schools. I think we see that. I mean, after all, they're over 50%, which is a sort of hidden answer to the other part of it, is that we're now ingrained into this town in such a way that it's very, very hard for anyone to really, you're pushing back up against the power structure if you're pushing back at the Latinos, not necessarily political power structure, but certainly a labor force and, year-round resident force, whether they're able to vote or not. But there's a tremendous force out here. So I think that, transitions like this have their arc, and when you go beginning of a transition is turmoil and chaos, and I think I would like to think we're mostly on the other side of that. I do think that you're right, Bill. I think that the discontent that the MAGA movement was able to harness um, remains there, and it is sort of the more superficial aspect of what many people feel in terms of discomfort. But I would say overall here, and I was particularly heartened by the response when Trump was first coronated, and started issuing his executive orders that were very hostile, at the response of local leadership and school districts, which some of them had to walk back a few things, but it was overall supportive, and I thought quite good. So I don't. But what I also add to that is that the tenor among the immigrants here, and when I speak to people, I'm assuming when they speak to me that they're undocumented just because of the context of the conversation, is of absolute fear. And I mentioned this guy who's self-deported because that reflects the kind of tensions that are here. I'm talking about people who have been here 20 years or more, who may not have regularized their status, but they're fearful of, in part because sometimes it's who's living in my house. Is someone may have either a immigration violation or not be completely in conformity, or it may be someone who had some past you know a small felony or even a misdemeanor that's in their household, and will that make them subject to someone knocking at the door because they become a target, and then they get swept in as collateral damage. So there's definitely fear out here. How that segments out between the more established population and those who are at risk, I don't really know. I do know that there's increasingly an infrastructure here of people of Latinos who are supportive.
Mhm.
I mean, Ola is an example of that.
Mhm. I want to bring Denise and Beth into the conversation. Everybody on this panel has lived in this region for, well over 20 years. It's a couple of generations. Um, we've seen a real evolution, haven't we? And I think it's true of Riverhead and the North Fork as much as it is on the South Fork. But are there differences in the way the Latino community has evolved in those areas?
Well, I do just sort of want to get back to Farmingville and the Suffolk County, and the further west on Suffolk County. In Suffolk County, it's policed by the county police department, and we have our own very localized police departments out here who all were involved with these statements that came out after these executive orders that they at the time they held public meetings. They issued statements saying this is our role, which is not really a role, but ICE doesn't contact us. They were giving advice about making sure that they have judicial warrants, but there's not much that people are saying, that elected leaders or police leaders are saying now. And now we've seen this in practice. And also, they're separating families now, and the words family separation policy they were in the lexicon 4 years ago, but we don't hear that, but it's happening all around us. And I don't know why the language has changed, because the separation is more extreme now.
If I could sort of address that, and these are just my quick thoughts, you're absolutely right. Family separation has not come up as an issue. And part of what concerns me about that is that, one, it's not as dramatic as it was at the border, right, where you see this concentration of media and you have dramatic footage of a child crawling out for her mother. Now it's more YouTube-y, sort of dispersed, diluted, because it's people who are capturing ICE breaking into their car window, a young woman being left behind, a kid being left behind, her mother having been deported or picked up for deportation. But I think that, so it's a difference in terms of the intensity. It's not new, but I think it's also a normalization factor that's going on there. And that's, I think, what's worrisome. As with so much else that is going on now, we're becoming conditioned. And we're the frog boiling, which is my favorite analogy. We are, and we continue to boil. And right now, it's no longer a simmer, but we don't realize how hot the water is for the most part. And I will say that there's a, you know, particularly here on the South Fork East End, um, we live in a blue zone bubble. And you go the further west you go, um, the the less that's true.
Mm.
And I know from our past conversations, Beth and Denise, that you all have pointed out to how things can be very different in the North Fork than they are in the South, particularly in Greenport. That's yeah.
And in Riverhead, Denise, it's different, right?
Sorry, Riverhead. I meant Riverhead. Sorry, yeah.
Yeah.
It's anything but a blue zone bubble. I tell you that. I think one thing that I think is kind of central to all of this is the demonization and dehumanization of the other. And I think that's something that allows people to feel like they're better than someone else. It's something that allows leaders, if you want to call them that, to tap into the grievance mentality that I think we've seen happening over and over again with just about every subject. And it's something that allows people to give themselves permission to just be really kind of just hateful toward other human beings, because they're not, not to use these words, but like, this is what our president has said repeatedly. They're animals. They're we get these press releases, I'm sure you do too, Joe and Bill and Beth, like, the worst of the worst, and all these kind of outrageous sort of press releases from DHS. It's like just a constant dehumanization of people and constant othering of people.
Let me just gently push back a little bit, though, Denise and Carlos. I'll bring this up, that when we talk about Western Suffolk County, I have to point out that there have been some pretty horrific crimes that have taken place that involve some of the gang elements, and I think that leads to some fear. There's an irony there, because I think the victims are almost always Latino. This is a crime. This is an instance of crime that is largely contained within the Latino community. But I think it sparks fear from some people.
I think stuff is blown way out of proportion. I mean, these things are publicized like they're, these are not the only crimes being committed. You know what I mean? Mm-hmm. Like, there are plenty of people committing horrific crimes against other people who are white-skinned, middle class, whatever, but when it's someone who's, brown or black skinned, they get blown out of proportion very quite intentionally, I think.
Well, I mean, the latest statistics are showing that the majority of the people in ICE detention right now do not have criminal convictions.
Sure. But if I could, to Joe's point, it is true that there was a period, was it 10, 15 years ago, where you had MS-13 active in towns like Brentwood, and there were horrible crimes that were taking place at that time, horrible. But that was back a while ago. I don't know. I haven't heard much lately in that regard. I think that Suffolk County took, and the towns themselves took several steps that may have been effective to that. And if I could just come back for a second to the East End, in terms of the difference, it kind of is one of the overarching themes to my column over the years, and that is that we have created a fairly welcoming community here. And by doing that, we have integrated the student population well, which means that they have not had to turn to alternatives like gangs in order to assert themselves. Mm-hmm. And that, to me, is the benefit of the payoff of that sort of constant, work, hard toil of making people feel wanted, accepted, and part of the community. I my experience, I mentioned it before, growing up in in the 1950s in Southern California, um, and being very much institutionally the other, was that many of us, including my brother, did go into gangs. It was a alternate form of protection, of living, of getting some sort of status and security. And if you're not provided with a means of progressing within a certain regime, then you're going to find other ways to do it, particularly among young men. It'll happen. So I think that kudos to the East End for having been able to stay out of keep from going having people go down that track. And I remember writing a column to this effect. I don't know how many years ago, but it seemed to me that what we and it was around the time of the MS-13 stuff going on in Brentwood, that we did not have evidence of that. We weren't subject to that. And my analysis then, and I think it holds, and I still hold it, is that we provided a different model, and it's paid off. It's paid off.
If you're just joining us, this is Behind the Headlines on WLIW. I'm Joe Shaw. My co-host is Bill Sutton. Our panelists this week are Denise Civiletti of Riverhead Local, Beth Young of the East End Beacon, and we're talking with Carlos Sandoval, who's a columnist for us at the Express News Group. He's going to be leaving the East End, and so we're just sort of looking back on his life out here and some of the observations. I think there's an economic factor here too, Carlos, that we're beginning to start to see on the East End that the Latino community has become so intertwined with the economy that any of this attempt to sort of demonize the Latino community and to force people to self deport, things like that, there's going to be a large economic impact, and I think we're just starting to feel that.
It's doing this, punching ourselves in the face when we don't accept that fact. And I would say that the sort of economic integration or power structure, you can kind of divide it in a couple of ways. Certainly, this economy is dependent on everyday labor, landscaping, construction, housekeeping, services of that sort, are what fuel our summer population in particular. We would not, I mean, when you drive, you cannot drive down the road without seeing, 3 or 4 landscaping trucks out there mowing lawns, doing maintenance work, let alone bringing in, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of landscaping for installation. That could not get done if it weren't for this population. The other way in which I think that I see this happening is that there is the entrepreneurial class that is now so heavily Latino out here. There's a little strip. I think I've referred to this in the past here in Amagansett on 27, where there's one store. It's called, I'm not going to name it, so it won't be going to Target, but it's I went in there because someone told me there was someone who could hem my pants there. And I was surprised to find there were not 1, not 2, but 3 businesses in the space.
Wow.
No, 4. The seamstress, a sort of party shop, a kind of deli, and in the back, a hair salon / beauty parlor. And then when I pulled in at one point, there was a truck, big panel van, supplying the beauty parlor, itinerant, warehouse. All that is going on. And it's out of the mainstream vision. So the entrepreneurial class is there and active. And now, I mean, the professional class, as I mentioned before, going into the bank today, the bank officers are, for the most part, I would say at least 40% Latinx. And I say Latinx only because I don't want to say Latino or Latina. They're both Hispanic. And they, and they're, the clientele, particularly at Bank of America, comes in, and it is at this time of year even predominantly Latinos that are going in there, and conducting their business. And these are,
Is the perception, Carlos, among the non-Latino community, is the perception still that the majority of the Latinx community that we see out here here illegally? I mean, obviously, you're not asking people what their immigration status is, and I would assume that percentage may be different depending on those three different classes that you talked about. But I know that I've spoken to non-Latino people out here that just assume anybody with a Spanish look, brown skin, Spanish name, that they're just all here illegally, and and that's the problem.
yeah, well, that's true. I mean, again, when I was in Farmingville, I was told to go back to the country I came from.
Yeah.
I kept going, well, would that be LA? Would that be California? Well, maybe go back to my father's country of birth, which is Colorado. And then if I go back before that, I have to go back to 1600 to maybe make it to Spain. But on the other hand, I have, native roots that take me back 10,000 years. So where am I supposed to go to? You're right. There is, I think, a perception that everyone out here is undocumented. That if you're brown skinned or have a Spanish surname, that you're off the boat or crossing the border.
But that's
And
what I was trying to make before, though. Like, you're otherized, okay?
Mhm.
And
Yeah.
like people very deliberately, for their own purposes, paint with a broad brush. And the way they say, "Oh, everybody who has brown skin is undocumented. Everyone who has brown skin, or pick a color, but is a member of a violent criminal gang,"
Right.
and making all of that seem so much bigger than it really is. I mean, not to say there was never a problem with MS-13 or anything like that, but it wasn't like everywhere you turned.
Well, I mean,
Well,
the pathway to
and it wasn't-
citizenship is a process, and it's a very long process, and there are many steps along it, and you can't explain it in a soundbite. I mean, there's so many different statuses. I mean, you could have TPS,
But
you could
people
be a
just
dreamer,
very
you
deliberately
know.
painting people as criminals and gang members for their own purposes. People are very susceptible. The non-Latino population is very susceptible to, and
Well, I
willing
mean,
to accept
if you ask somebody, are you undocumented, and it's always going to be a long conversation. Well, I have this document, but not this document, and I'm working on this one, and so you can't. It's not a yes or no question,
I think we took
and
a
that's
step
why
in.
it's so
I'm
difficult
not talking about being
for people
documented.
to know.
I mean, why are we so willing to believe that people who are of a particular ethnicity are all gang members, or
Sure,
people who are like Sicilian,
but
like we're all mafioso? Like,
sure.
it
But
was
that
the
that
same
does
kind of
trans
thing,
that was the same kind of thing that did happen, and that was to Beth's point. Though I will say that there was a change in the nomenclature just in the last year or two, where the statements are now being made by federal officials who say, if you cross the border without permission, you are a criminal.
committed a crime.
That was not true a few years ago. I think there was a distinction made that said, there are a lot of people who are in this country right now who cross the border without permission to seek asylum, which is a perfectly legal thing to do, and they are in the system waiting for a decision on asylum. They are not here illegally, but I think there's a rhetoric now that says, if you're here and you don't have official permission to be here, as Beth said, it's a long process. It takes time. There are steps. But if you don't have that permission in hand, you're illegal. You have broken the law. You are a criminal. That's a really significant step up in the rhetoric.
Yeah, I mean, what prompted me to make the film in Arizona was this law called SB 1070, which wanted to criminalize mere presence if you were undocumented. They needed to go to that sort of a step to do it because, for the most part, it was civil violations. And we had a little bit of this we touched on this conversation one time when we were all together before. I think Beth brought up the question of, is it criminal to be here, in fact? And the answer is it is. If you cross the border, it may be a misdemeanor, sort of a small violation. If you overstay a visa, then it's a civil penalty. So, but what's you're absolutely right, Joe, in that what this administration has succeeded in doing is criminalize, is putting everyone in one bucket, calling them criminal, justifying then their deportation actions, the mass deportation, which they promised, and it seems to be the one promise that they really want to keep. Let's not get into the economy. So, it becomes convenient to say, oh, they're not really criminals because they don't have a criminal past record here in the United States or in their country of origin, but they're criminals because we made them criminals by virtue of their presence. And so you can bootstrap their criminality that way.
Mhm.
Is it going to hold in fact under courts of law? Probably not. And that's what, but then let's do away with due process so that we don't have to worry about that. It's
Mhm.
this very tight little machine that they're making right now. And I mean, to be specific, the Trump administration is creating right now. And in answer to Denise's question, an observation with regards to Denise's question about othering, uh, that's a process that happens. Again, I go back in terms of blaming, certain siloed media for this. In places like Fox News or wherever people go off to get their social media, that creates that perception, and it's very hard. What's harder is nuance and texture. What's harder is to go through the analysis that we've been going through here for the past 45 minutes of how do we tease this out? What are the legitimate issues? How do we determine, how do we establish that not everyone is undocumented? Not all people who are undocumented are criminal. And many are here under circumstances that were no different from when your grandparents came over.
What do you think the future holds, Carlos? I mean, obviously we're all sort of in a moment, and it's hard to think about the future. But what do you think is going to happen out here specifically in the next few years?
Out here,
Yeah,
um, I'm trying to drag out my crystal ball right now.
yeah,
Uh,
exactly. I realize I'm
uh,
asking.
I would, I'm basically an optimist, but I'm also a realist enough to know that things won't go smoothly. That I think that what will happen over the next few years is that there'll be more pressure to bear to round up people who are undocumented. Um, that I, and that pressure is probably going to arrive at the East End at some point. Um, and I want to go into a little anecdotal thing that is kind of relevant here, and that is I live in Amagansett, as we referred to, and a dear friend, a neighbor, woman who immigrated from Germany 60 years ago, was going about her business in her yard when this guy suddenly appeared, um, without, you know, a plain clothes, no identification, and he was telling her that he was part of a criminal investigation. I mean, she was feeling incredibly vulnerable and alarmed. And she told him, basically told him get off my property, but after some sort of exchange. And this made the headlines out here, because it was this bizarre activity that took place where it may have been criminal related. Um, but it was it's unclear whether it was ICE or not that was leading it. But her first response was to reach out to me and say, I think ICE has been here. And that traumatized her so much. And I think that part of that was also the fact that she felt as an immigrant that she could be targeted at this point too.
Mm.
I mean, this is the level of fear that is happening out here. Um, I I think things will get worse before they get better. I hope not, but I think they will. I do think that they will rebalance themselves. The center sort of has a way of reemerging, and I take this lesson from the films that I made around immigration, that the center generally tends to hold. But that's what I thought was going to happen in this last round, and it hasn't. It's gotten a lot worse. Um,
Mhm.
so I think that eventually, um, it will normalize to a degree. If anything good comes out of this, there may be some level of immigration reform at the federal level. Um, but I think we're a long, long way from there. That right now for me is a pipe dream.
We
Great.
have a couple of minutes left, Carlos. I'm curious what your future plans are professionally. Are you going to be making movies? Are you making more documentaries? Are you going to be writing more? What are you hoping to do?
I hope to write more. My great life's ambition, and it's been part of on my bucket list since I was in college and presented it as a possible thesis topic, is to do a sort of family memoir. At that point, it's going to be my family in Puerto Rico. Now I've expanded it to I want to incorporate my father's family in northern New Mexico, southern Colorado, northern New Mexico, and my mother's family in Puerto Rico. Excuse me,
Bless you.
and use that as a reflection on what it means to be an American today. To have it be sort of a family memoir or saga that traces to all that in a kind of episodic narrative. So it's been something I wanted to do for years, and I have had various false starts in the past.
The
In fact,
country's 250th birthday is coming up. Seems like a good time for that.
well, yeah, ain't gonna get done in time for that. But I mean, in my circuitous route, I started writing it, realized I couldn't wrestle it down. Instead, I ended up with a play that I had a reading at a theater, a couple of screenplays that never went anywhere, and eventually filmmaking, which diverted me from all that. So now, maybe once my life settles down again, I might go to that. And I now have a way that I can conceive of it, that I see providing the structure and framework for all these disparate stories.
Telling stories is an important part of all this, right? I mean,
Oh yeah.
it's how you get through difficult times in this country.
Well, yeah. But you've hit another political sore point, which is I consider this to be history because I'm going to be doing enough research to verify some central facts, not necessarily the family stories or lore that are there, but we haven't really talked about them too much. But I made a film about that was on an American experience about the early Mexican American civil rights movement in the 1950s, a case that went up to the Supreme Court called Hernandez versus Texas. And that story, when I worked on it, was unknown, relatively unknown. It's now in curricula, this cases and in classrooms, but all that is in jeopardy of being erased by this administration. The way we are going back and wiping clean our history, literally whitewashing it. Those are the stories that really need to be told. Those are the stories we need to hold on to. We're in danger of being erased again. And that's, that I think is so yes, storytelling is important, but history, which I never thought would be such a lively subject, is important too.
Mm-hmm. Carlos, I will venture to say that we're going to miss you on the East End. I have really enjoyed having you on our staff as a columnist, and I look forward to seeing what you do going forward, and the best of luck to you. Thank
you. I want to thank you all for making a part of this particular community. And Joe, a special thanks to you and the Express News Group for carrying my column for so long. It has expanded me in so many different ways, and you've been a wonderful, wonderful, light-handed editor. So I really appreciate all that. It's been my pleasure, believe me. So thank you also to Denise Civiletti of Riverhead Local and Beth Young of the East End Beacon. And thank you also to my co-host, Bill Sutton. I'm Joe Shaw. We'll be back next time with another edition of Behind the Headlines. Thank you, guys, and good luck, Carlos.
Thank you.
Thank you.